All right, this is the online lesson guide for Chapter 1, Politics, Setting the Stage. So the first question we want to ask is, what is politics? Politics is arguably one of the most important aspects of any society because everything else emanates from that eventually over time, such as the economic systems or the civil society itself or the stability of the country. Unfortunately, it's one of the things that we take the most for granted or even discount or complain about the most, even though it's the most important thing. So politics could be considered the exercise of power for making common decisions for groups. It could also be described as who gets what, when, and how, or to have a say or a share in the organization and leadership in the policies of government. Now, as we go through this video, you can pause it and take notes if you would like. At the end of this chapter, I'll talk about what are some of the things to focus on for the quiz. Now, why is government necessary? Because that is the ultimate function of your political organizations, the people to get together and figure out how and why they want to govern. And I've boiled it down into three basic points here as to why government is necessary. The first, and the one that comes to students' mind the quickest, is to simply maintain order of your society. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes said that if we don't, unless we sacrifice some of our freedom to the state that's going to protect us, then life could be nasty, brutish, and short. So maintaining order, obviously one of the primary reasons. We also have government to protect our individual liberties and our property. Now, obviously, some countries do this better than other countries or do it differently than other countries. And we're going to be talking about that through the course as to what the differences are between various political systems. But the United States system of government is based on John Locke's philosophy of liberalism that we'll be talking about in Chapter 2, very important principles of what our government system is based on, which is very, very strong at trying to protect our individual liberties and our property rights. Now, another reason why government is necessary is to provide public goods. Now, these are goods that are not typically provided by the market as consumer products. Now, on the national level, some of the most prominent public goods are our national defense and our criminal justice system and our education system. Now, of course, a lot of that is paid for locally. So local public goods would be your public education K through 12 that's paid through for the most part by property taxes. You've also got your fire departments, your police departments, your public transportation systems. These are all systems that are provided by the government through taxes or fees and other ways of raising money for public goods and services. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about public goods later on in this chapter because one of the first exercises I may have you do is to brainstorm public goods as to what public goods could potentially be provided by the market if we wanted to swap them out, or what are some of the things that we typically rely on for the market. Are there some things that we would prefer to be public goods? So we'll talk about that more in a minute. Very important quote here from a recent book, was well received. While economic institutions are critical for determining whether a country is poor or prosperous, it is politics and political institutions that determine what economic institutions a country has. So this is why politics ultimately is very important to a society, because over time everything emanates from that. The stability of your country is a function of your political system. Now, there's different ways of achieving power. Power is a very important topic in political science, because ultimately people get together to decide who is going to be in charge. So there's various ways of achieving power. One way is through force or through coercion, by taking it from other people or just assuming it through force or strength or might. And there are some systems in the world that are still in place and have been taken through force. For example, through military coups or just the assertion of power because of the perception of strength. Influence is another way to achieve power. This is typically through persuasion, and you could rise to leadership by being very persuasive in your policies, in your personality, various ways of influencing, in order to either get elected or to be handpicked by predecessors, things like that. Now, authority is the type of power that is legitimized through recognition. So there's some sort of process in your system that recognizes you as being an authority, whether it's through elections or other types of traditions that we'll talk about. So in other words, this authority has been socially approved or legitimized, and the book talks about a few ways that that legitimacy is obtained to get that authority. So let's talk a little bit more about authority, because we can break those into three basic types of authority. Now, traditional authority is one that has essentially been handed down over time through customs and accepted practices. For example, a king. So if a person is born into the royal family, they will become king or a monarch, or it could be just passed down through family. For example, in North Korea, Kim Jong-un was handed the leadership by his father. So that's called traditional authority. Another type of authority is called legal authority, and this is the type of authority that we have in the United States that's based on a written rule of law that everybody abides by and respects, such as the Constitution. And we will talk more about the U.S. Constitution and constitutions in general in a later chapter. It's a very important concept of this rule of law. Now, charismatic authority simply means that the leader has been legitimized because of a very powerful or exceptional personal or emotional appeal. He appeals to people through their emotions and kind of becomes almost leadership by popular support. And we've got several examples of that. Gandhi is an example of a charismatic authority who was kind of he took the role of leadership to lead India to independence from Britain. We also have, you could say, Nelson Mandela, a very charismatic authority after getting out of prison, being in prison for so many years, and then very popular person that becomes leader. And Martin Luther King was considered somewhat, he was put in the position of leadership of the civil rights movement because of his personal appeal. Now, there's obviously negative examples of that with, for example, Hitler, a very powerful, charismatic person that came to power and then came to absolute power. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So charismatic authority could go either way, but that's what that means. Now, this is a very important term, the state. Now, whenever I use the word state, that term in the political science terminology means country. So the United States is actually a state out there in the world. Japan is a state. Brazil is a state. Venezuela is a state. Iraq. They're states. Once you've been recognized as a state, then you are afforded some privileges of a state, which we're going to talk about in considerable more detail in Chapter 3. So whenever I use the term state, I'm not talking about Texas or New Jersey. I'm talking about a country. And so therefore, out there in the world where we don't have a global president, global leadership, we see that the state is the central autonomous unit of the international system. We got a collection of states that choose or not choose to interact with each other. That's what makes the world such an interesting place. We'll talk about that more. Therefore, the state is also defined as the organizing body of that society of politics, governance, and responsibility for the economic conditions. So the state is the overarching term of that system. Now, when it comes to power models, we have three basic power models here that could all three be used to define even the United States system. The power elite model is where you have a relatively small group of insiders or economically powerful people that coordinate with the elected leaders or the military leaders to influence policy. Now, this is not meant to be conspiratorial. This is rational behavior of people that aspire to leadership and other people elect them to leadership. Corporate CEOs are very ambitious and rise to the top and become very influential on policy because they run major corporations that produces lots of goods and hires lots of people. And so therefore they have kind of a inside track, so to speak, to influence policy. And then when the election changed hands, you still have that power elite for the most part that it is kind of influencing basic government policy. Again, not meant to be conspiratorial. That's just kind of how it works when people aspire to be the leader, just like you or me. However, you could also describe the United States system as being a pluralist model, or what we call pluralism, where you have your policy in our system is influenced by a diversity of competing groups. Now, these groups are various assortment of groups, such as identity groups, ethnic groups, corporate groups, business groups, any type of interest group that is willing to organize and collect dues and gather members and get strength in their membership and their economic power, and therefore they can influence government policy by just their voice. And we'll talk a lot more about interest groups later, but the interest groups are obviously not equal in their influence because some interest groups, such as the NRA or the AARP, that have single issues that they want to focus on, and they can influence policy disproportionately. So we'll talk about those things when we talk about interest groups, but clearly a useful description of the United States system of how policy gets made. Now, controlling the agenda is kind of a mix, where it's more of a complex relationship between the elite and the media and public opinion, which of course is influenced also by both the media and interest groups. But what's happening is if these groups can generate enough attention to a particular issue, then it will overcome the status quo of never getting anything done, and it will overcome that threshold and something will start getting done about it. So that's a little bit more of a complex model of how power is achieved through policymaking. The book talks about how not only is power important, but people choose as far as what they want for their system. There's a universal human need for a strong government, which means one that we can rely on to get things done, not necessarily a dictatorship, but we're looking for a government that we can trust to get things done and takes the initiative or protects us, that sort of thing. But we're doing this through many individual exercises of power, through voting, through interest groups, through individual leadership, all that kind of stuff. Now, a very important term that is that you want to understand in politics and society is the term of an institution. Now, we're not talking about a brick building. We're talking about a norm, a process, or a system that has been created primarily by those in power which evolve over time and they shape our behavior. For example, a rule of law, particularly through the Constitution. The Constitution is a very solid institution that was actually created by a handful of men. Only 38 men signed the Constitution, and you could argue that there's 3 or 4 men that contributed the vast majority of what's in that Constitution. And yet to this day, that Constitution still determines our rule of law and shapes human behavior as a result. So institutions are very important. And of course, politics here is the interplay between power and choice as described in the textbook. So let's talk a little bit more about public goods. Public goods are, of course, what is provided by the government through our tax dollars or through our fees or through our local property taxes and sales taxes and things like that. Income taxes on the national level. Even some states have a state income tax. But these goods, as we've talked about, such as the national defense or public transportation or even particularly our education system, these public goods are considered non-rival in consumption. That means that my use of it does not detract from your use of it. If I want to send my child to the public school, that's not going to prevent you from sending your child to the same public school. My use of it does not keep you from using it. They're also non-excludable. So if it's a public good, that means all the citizens are allowed to use that public school or to use that public road. As long as they obey the laws, of course, and not speed and lose their driver's license. Or particularly with the national defense, we all benefit in general from the protection that our national defense system provides for us. Obviously not perfect, and in certain events can happen or slip through the cracks, but generally everybody is afforded that protection. So public goods, as we've mentioned, have characteristics that make it difficult for the private sector to produce them profitably, even though there have been attempts to do that. We have toll roads where the government contracts or delegates somebody to build a highway and then they can charge a toll for it. Or we can have private schools, things like that. So there's different aspects of public goods that some people may actually want to make them private in order to take some of the burden off the government to do that, or perhaps lower tax dollars. But generally, after all this time, if a public good would actually be more efficient being provided by the market or being put out there as a consumer product, it would have probably done that more successfully a pretty long time ago. So this is why it's still very somewhat controversial issue as to what goods should be public, should be private, but pretty strong consensus on most of them. Now, because people cannot be excluded from getting a public good benefit, they're often unwilling to pay for them. And these are what we call free riders. For somebody, for example, who does not pay their taxes but still gets the benefits of the. Now, that doesn't mean that if they don't make enough money, obviously they may not make enough to pay taxes, but that if somebody makes enough money but then cheats on their taxes, yes, you could say that's a free rider because they're getting benefits without paying for them technically. A good example of a free rider is, for example, when I'm watching public TV or when I'm listening to KERA public radio. I listen to that a lot. I watch public TV every now and then, particularly the news hour. And whenever they have their membership drive to raise funds, and if I just say, never mind, and I change channel and I never contribute, well, then I would start to feel like a free rider. So occasionally I feel like I need to contribute money to that public service to get that benefit and contribute to paying for it. Now, as far as preparing for the quiz, now keep in mind, I'll put more instructions on the quiz later. And so the quiz is going to be kind of a mixture of the book and these notes, these slides, because you can see on these slides that I talk about a few things that aren't specifically in the book. So here's some things to prepare yourselves. For example, what are some public goods? What are the three types of authority that we talked about? What are the three types of power models that we talked about? What's the definition of a free rider? What does an institution do? So those are some of the things that you would certainly want to focus on a little bit in order to do well on the quiz in the time allotted. So that concludes the online lesson guide for Chapter 1.